It was a Tuesday afternoon, which in the restaurant world means the absolute worst kind of rush. People were streaming into the Corner Bistro in downtown Toronto, all hungry and impatient, looking for a quick lunch break. The bistro wasn't fancy, but it had this cozy, brick-walled vibe and served the kind of food that made you feel hugged on a cold day. That's why it was always packed. In the middle of this chaos was Alara. Hey there and welcome back. I'm so happy you're here. Grab that blanket, maybe pour yourself a hot drink and get really comfortable because today we're settling in for a story you won't forget. Before we dive any deeper though, let me know how you're doing. Drop a quick comment and tell me what part of the world you're watching from today. And if you want to stay with us through all the twists and turns ahead, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a moment. Alright, let's get back to it. Alara was the kind of person you barely noticed until she looked right at you. She was small, maybe 5'4", with dark hair that she always pulled back into a neat, tight bun. She had the eyes of someone who had seen too much. A little sad, a little tired, but still holding on to a tiny spark of defiance. Most people just saw a waitress with an apron covered in coffee stains and maybe a smudge of tomato sauce on her cheek. They saw her rushing plates, refilling water, and wiping down tables with a practiced, weary efficiency. But if you looked closer, you'd notice the way she gripped the serving tray, a little too tightly, and the way she moved not with the quick energy of a young woman, but with the careful, almost rigid posture of someone trying very hard not to hurt. She never lingered. She smiled when she had to, but the smile never quite reached her eyes. She was just trying to make it through the shift like she tried to make it through every day. She needed this job. Every dollar she earned was tied up in a complicated, silent promise she had made to herself. That Tuesday the rush was hitting different. The kitchen was yelling, the phone was ringing off the hook for takeout orders, and the air conditioner had chosen that exact moment to sound like a dying lawnmower. Alara was weaving through the narrow aisles, carrying a heavy stack of empty dinner plates that felt like they weighed a ton. She had skipped lunch and her body was running on fumes and sheer willpower. Then everything went quiet. Not for the whole restaurant but for Alara. She felt the room tilt, the bright overhead lights blurring into a single painful white flash. The noise, the clatter of silverware, the roar of conversation, turned into a muffled, distant hum. She tried to take a deep breath to steady herself, but her lungs felt tight, like they were wrapped in iron bands. She took one more wobbly step and then, without warning, her knees gave out. The stack of plates slipped from her grasp and crashed to the polished wooden floor, sounding like a gunshot in the suddenly stunned restaurant. People gasped. And Alara followed the plates down, collapsing right in the aisle between table 6 and table 7. Now, among the busy lunch crowd, there was a table that always stood out. The corner booth, always reserved, always quiet. Sitting there was Mr. Damien Thorne. Damien Thorne was not the kind of man you forgot. He was big, not in a clumsy way but in a way that suggested effortless power. He wore expensive suits that somehow never looked stuffy, and his dark eyes had a kind of intense focus that made everyone around him feel like they were being sized up. He was notoriously private and rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice was low and commanding. In certain circles, people knew him as the kind of man who moved mountains without ever raising his voice. They called him the fixer, the kind of guy whose presence alone could change the whole temperature of a room. To the people in the bistro, he was just a regular wealthy customer who tipped well and liked his coffee black. But he was far more than that. He was a man accustomed to seeing danger and spotting secrets hidden in plain sight. When the plates crashed, every eye in the bistro jumped up. But while most people just froze, awkwardly deciding whether to stare or help, Damien Thorne acted instantly. He rose from the booth with a liquid ease that was surprising for a man his size. He walked straight past the gaping manager and the nervous busboys, moving directly toward the small figure huddled on the floor. Alara was curled in on herself, her breath coming in shallow, quick gasps. She looked less like a person who had fainted and more like someone trying to disappear. Damien knelt beside her, ignoring the broken porcelain pieces scattered around them. He didn't touch her right away. He simply lowered himself so his dark eyes were level with hers. For a moment she seemed confused, her own eyes fluttering open, trying to make sense of the man's expensive shoes right next to her face. "Hey," he said, and his voice was startlingly gentle. A deep rumble completely at odds with his formidable appearance. "You all right? Take a breath for me." She tried to push herself up, the desperate need to get back to work overriding the pain. "I'm fine, sir. I slipped." I'll clean it up. He shook his head slowly. You're not fine. It was as he reached out a hand intending only to steady her that he saw it. Ilara had instinctively moved to shield her left arm when she fell, pulling the sleeve of her uniform shirt slightly up toward her elbow. The fabric was thin, and where the material had pulled tight, Damien saw something that made him pause. It wasn't the kind of scrape you get from falling on the floor. It was a bruise, a large angry bloom of deep purple and sickly yellow that wrapped around her forearm. And not just one. There was a scattering of smaller, older-looking marks that were carefully trying to fade into her pale skin. He gently, almost imperceptibly, brushed his fingertips against the edge of the injury, and Ilara flinched, a sharp, almost silent whimper escaping her lips. It was a reaction he knew well. This was not an accident. These were wounds. Hidden, deliberate, and fresh. Damien Thorne had seen a lot of things in his life. Betrayal, violence, desperation. But seeing this small woman trying to hide such evident pain in the middle of a busy restaurant hit him hard. All the noise, all the rush, the broken dishes. It all faded away. The only thing that mattered was the vulnerable person curled up on the floor in front of him. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the horrified, whispering customers. No one was looking at the manager. They were all looking at the man in the suit kneeling beside the waitress. He looked back at Ilara, whose face was now pale with a mixture of pain and fear. Not fear of him, but fear of being seen. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that nonetheless carried clearly in the suddenly silent room. The question was simple, but it felt like thunder. Who did this to you? The air in the corner bistro solidified. The chef stopped yelling. The dishwasher stopped running. The manager, frozen mid-step, looked like a statue. Everyone heard the question. It wasn't an inquiry. It was a demand delivered with a quiet, lethal authority. Ilara's breath hitched. Her tired eyes, which had held so much weariness, suddenly filled with a raw, panicked terror. She looked at Damien Thorne, this powerful, imposing man who had invaded her careful silence, and she knew who he was, or at least she felt the power he radiated. She knew that answering that question could either save her or destroy her completely. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head almost imperceptibly, her lips pressed into a thin, stubborn line. She didn't speak. She wouldn't. She couldn't. And that silence, that absolute, terrified refusal to speak, hit Damien Thorne harder than any verbal confession of pain or plea for help ever could have. It was a silence filled with years of fear, of secrets, and of a deep, heartbreaking conviction that talking wouldn't change anything, or perhaps would only make things much, much worse. He didn't move away. He stayed kneeling there, his intense gaze locked on her face. Her silence was a heavy, complicated weight, and in that moment, Damien knew he was looking at something bigger than a slip tray. He was looking at a woman who was fiercely protecting someone, or perhaps simply protecting the darkness she was forced to live in. And her silence, instead of pushing him away, drew him in. It was a puzzle he felt compelled to solve, not with force, but with a sudden, overwhelming urge to protect her from the unseen hand that had caused those ugly wounds. Slowly, carefully, he helped her sit up, one hand supporting her back. "All right," he murmured, accepting her refusal for the moment. "Let's get you off the floor." The manager finally snapped out of his daze and rushed over, but Damien simply looked up, his expression unreadable, and dismissed him with a subtle shake of his head. Ilara was silent the whole time, her eyes fixed on the floor, ashamed and terrified. But as Damien gently guided her toward the staff room, a tiny, unfamiliar seed of hope, small and fragile as a dewdrop, began to settle in the deep, dark corners of her heart. She was hurt, she was exposed, but for the first time in a very long time she wasn't alone. And though she refused to speak, the protection in this strange man's eyes was a comfort she couldn't deny. She had collapsed, but maybe, just maybe, she had collapsed into safety. The back room of the corner bistro was small, hot, and smelled strongly of disinfectant and stale coffee. It was where Ilara always went to quickly change her apron or sneak a 5-minute break. But now, sitting on an overturned milk crate, it felt like a cage. And the cage had a very large, imposing keeper. Damien Thorne. He hadn't left. He had simply insisted that the frantic manager bring her a glass of water, and then he had stood by the doorway, silently watching. He looked completely out of place in the messy service area, his expensive suit immaculate against the peeling paint and cluttered shelves. The manager, a sweaty, nervous man named Frank, kept hovering outside, peeking in every few minutes, but Damien's mere presence kept him from rushing in. Elara kept her head bowed, staring intently at the scuffed toes of her work shoes. She knew he was still there, and his silence was more unnerving than any interrogation. It gave her nowhere to hide. "Tell me about your arm," Damien finally said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of command. He wasn't asking, he was stating that this was the topic of conversation. Elara flinched. She immediately pulled her sleeve down further, smoothing the thin cotton over the painful area as if that could somehow erase the sight he'd had of it. "It's nothing, sir. Really. I bruise easily. I hit it on the edge of the fridge door last night when I was closing up." Her voice was soft, maybe a little too quick, and she still didn't look up. "The fridge door," Damien repeated, a hint of something, not mockery but deep skepticism in his tone. "That's quite a bruise for hitting a fridge door, Elara. That looks like someone used your arm as a punching bag." Now she finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes were wide, and the fear in them was no longer the generic panic of a woman who just fainted in public. It was the specific terror of a secret being uncovered. She looked away just as fast, avoiding his direct gaze entirely. "No. No one did anything," she insisted, shaking her head vigorously. "Please, Mr. Thorne. It was an accident. I swear. I am clumsy. I'm always knocking into things." And that was the moment when Damien's curiosity began to turn into a dangerous certainty. He had dealt with liars, professional manipulators, and hardened criminals for half his life. He knew the difference between a spontaneous fib and a rehearsed lie. Elara's insistence that she was clumsy, her refusal to meet his eye, and the rigid, practiced way she deflected his concern all screamed of something learned. It was the practiced language of someone who had had to explain away wounds before. She was not just hiding something, she was protecting the source of the injury. And that was far more unsettling. He took a slow step closer, leaning against the doorframe, still keeping a respectful distance, but his intensity filled the small space. "Elara," he said, using her name deliberately, making it sound serious, important. "When you fell, you didn't cry out from hitting the floor. You made a small sound when I touched your arm. And you curled up like you were trying to shield yourself from a blow, not from the pain of a faint." He watched her carefully, noting the way her jaw tensed. She was like a trapped bird, ready to bolt but nowhere to fly. "You said no one did anything," he continued, his voice calm, persuasive. "I want you to look at me and tell me that those bruises on your arm are from a fridge door." She hesitated for a long, painful beat. She bit the inside of her lip, her brow furrowed in misery. She desperately wanted to tell him the lie, to convince him, just so he would leave her alone and let her get back to the familiar misery of her life. But when she finally forced herself to look up, her composure cracked. The fear in her eyes was too raw, too genuine, to pair with the manufactured explanation. "It was an accident," she whispered, the conviction completely gone from her voice. The words were a flat, meaningless sound. She looked completely defeated. Damien didn't press her further on the details of the injury. Her non-confession was a confirmation in itself. He shifted tactics, moving from the physical injury to her situation. "You work double shifts here, don't you?" he asked. "Frank told me you picked up an extra closing shift last night and an early lunch today." She nodded once, slowly. "I need the money." "And what happens to the money?" "I pay rent. And bills. Just like everyone else." She was back on safe ground now, giving him the standard, relatable answer. Damien knew this game. He knew that when people are in deep trouble, they cling to the simplest, most mundane explanations to keep the world at bay. He had seen the way fear made people build high walls of normalcy around terrifying secrets. He looked around the cramped staff room, at the cheap lockers, the sticky floor, the general air of exhaustion that clung to everything. This was not the life of a woman who just needed extra cash for a treat. This was the life of a woman running from something, using endless work as a shield and a source of necessary, desperate funds. A feeling began to stir in Damien, one he hadn't experienced since he was a younger man fighting his own complicated battles. It wasn't pity, which he generally despised, but a sharp, cutting sense of injustice. He had spent years in a world where power was used to crush the weak. Here was a clear example, and it was happening right under his nose on his regular lunch route. "Elara," he said, leaning in slightly. "I own a few buildings in this city. I know Frank, your manager, pretty well. I can make sure you never step foot in this restaurant again and still get paid for the next 6 months. She gasped, truly shocked now. No. Please. I need this job. Don't do that. I haven't done anything wrong. I know you haven't, Damien said gently. But if I'm right and you are protecting someone who is hurting you, then you staying here is putting you in danger. And running back to them when your shift ends is putting you in danger. He looked directly into her eyes, and this time she couldn't look away. His gaze wasn't cold or demanding. It was earnest, strangely vulnerable for a man like him. I won't call anyone. I won't ask questions of the police. I am just offering you a way out of the immediate stress. A safe place. Time to think. Silence, he offered. I respect your silence, Alara. But silence is not innocence. And the person who did that to your arm? They are not innocent. She stared at him, her lips slightly parted. The offer was unbelievable. 6 months of pay, no strings attached, just for leaving this hellish routine. Sounded like a trap, like something out of a bad dream. But the look in his eyes, it was compelling. It made the terror of her own situation feel, for a fleeting second, less heavy. I can't, she stammered, shaking her head again, though the denial was weaker this time. I have to be here. I have commitments. Damien let out a slow, quiet breath. He had expected the refusal. Fear of the known, however painful, is often stronger than the promise of the unknown. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple black business card. He didn't have a title printed on it, just a name, Damien Thorne, and a single phone number. He placed the card on the milk crate next to her hand, careful not to touch her. Keep this, he instructed. It's my direct line. If you need me to make Frank go away, I can. If you need me to get you out of this city, I can. If you just need someone to call and talk to without judgment, I will answer. He paused, his gaze softening slightly. That is not a question, Alara. That is a promise. He gave her a final appraising look, one that said, I see you and I know your truth. Then he turned and walked out of the staff room, leaving Alara alone with the silence, the stale smell of coffee, and the terrifying, shining hope of the black business card resting beside her trembling hand. She had refused to answer his question, but in his unwavering concern she felt the first true warmth she had experienced in months. Damien Thorne didn't go back to his corner booth. He walked straight out of the corner bistro, leaving behind the nervous chatter and the broken plates. He knew he had just dropped a dangerous seed into Alara's life, the possibility of hope, and that seed needed careful watching if it wasn't to be immediately crushed by the fear she carried. He got into the back of his sleek black sedan, which was waiting discreetly on a side street. The driver, a quiet, solid man named Marcus, immediately pulled into the city traffic, heading towards the financial district. Damien didn't even need to say a full sentence. He just pulled out his phone, already reviewing a list of names, and made a single crisp call. Get me Elias, he ordered. Elias was one of Damien's most unusual and most valuable assets. While others in Damien's organization were built for confrontation and moving heavy operations, Elias was built for blending in. He was a ghost. He could spend days on a busy street corner, dressed in completely unremarkable clothes, holding a damp coffee cup, and no one would remember seeing him later. He specialized in observation, silent, tireless, and absolute. When Elias answered, Damien's instructions were minimal, delivered in a low, controlled voice that Marcus behind the wheel could barely hear. I need eyes on a woman named Alara. Waitress at the corner bistro downtown Toronto. Black hair, small, wears a tight bun. She works all hours. I want to know where she lives, who she interacts with, and what her routine is after she leaves the restaurant. Everything. Elias, known for his directness, simply replied, Timeline, sir. Immediate. Start tonight, Damien said. He paused, looking out at the endless stream of people on the sidewalk. Listen carefully, Elias. Do not intervene. Do not spook her. Do not make contact. This is purely observation. I need facts, not drama. I need to know what she is running from. Understood. Understood, Mr. Thorne. The line clicked dead. This was how Damien Thorne worked. He didn't force answers from the vulnerable, he gathered them from the shadows. Alara's refusal to speak had told him more than any detailed confession could have. It told him the threat was real, it was close, and it was so terrifying that she preferred silence and pain over the risk of exposure. His goal now was to map the hidden terrain of her fear. That evening, Alara finished her double shift. She was exhausted, the bruising on her arm throbbing with a deep, heavy ache. The fear from her collapse had been replaced by a tight, sickening dread about the black business card still tucked into the pocket of her jeans. She kept touching it, feeling the smooth, heavy card stock, a piece of proof that a man of unimaginable power had seen her weakness. As she stepped out of the warmth of the bistro and into the cold evening air, she pulled her thin jacket tight around her shoulders. She looked no different than the thousands of other tired commuters shuffling through the Canadian streets, but tonight she felt different. Exposed. She began her walk home, a route she knew by heart, past the brightly lit pubs and the quiet residential streets near the Annex neighborhood. She walked quickly, her head down, lost in the weary rhythm of her steps. A few blocks back, blended seamlessly into the crowd, was Elias. Elias was a master of routine. He noticed the cheap, worn quality of Alara's shoes, the way she checked her phone constantly but never actually made a call, and the subtle, almost automatic way her eyes darted to every dark doorway and every parked car. She walked like someone always expecting danger to jump out from the periphery. She eventually turned onto a quiet, tree-lined street and disappeared into a weathered 3-story brownstone apartment building. Elias set up his observation post across the street, near a community garden, adjusting his position slightly so he was always just a regular guy fiddling with his backpack or tying his shoelace. He pulled out a small notepad and began logging the facts. It was a slow, routine start, the kind of boring surveillance that made up 99% of Elias's work. But then about an hour later things began to shift from routine to unsettling. At 12:25 a.m., the light in Alara's apartment went out. Standard. At 12:30 a.m. a battered, dark-colored pickup truck, the kind that looked like it had seen too many hard winters, pulled up 2 doors down from Alara's building. It didn't belong on this quiet, middle-class street. A man got out. Elias immediately shifted his focus. This wasn't just a neighbor coming home late. The man was big, built like a fire hydrant, and moved with a heavy, purposeful gait. He wore a thick leather jacket and didn't bother to lock his truck. He didn't look up or down the street but walked straight to Alara's building. Elias noted the time and the man's description without moving a muscle. The man didn't knock on Alara's door. Elias saw the faint shadow on the 3rd-floor window as the man entered the apartment. He had a key. Then the true nature of the surveillance changed. At 1:05 a.m., a sound, faint but unmistakable, traveled across the street and reached Elias's trained ears. It was a sharp, percussive noise followed by a heavy thump. Sounded like something large being thrown against a wall. Elias felt the automatic ice-cold pull of professional training telling him to stay put. Do not intervene. Preserve. But the sound was raw, and it was quickly followed by a muffled, wordless cry, a sound that could only belong to Alara. For the next 10 minutes, the silence from the apartment was heavier than the noise had been. It was the kind of silence that suggests a deep, terrifying stillness inside. Elias, whose job was to never feel anything, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The surveillance had gone from tracing a routine to witnessing something ugly and immediate. He logged the details meticulously, writing down the exact times and sounds. Finally, at 1:20 a.m., the door to the brownstone opened, and the large man in the leather jacket emerged. He walked back to his pickup truck, his heavy steps unhurried, almost complacent. He looked absolutely untouched by the visit, like he had just been borrowing sugar. As the man drove away, Elias caught a glimpse of his face under a flickering streetlight. A broad, hard face with a short, rough beard, etched with casual brutality. This was the source of Alara's practiced fear. This was the man who had inflicted the wounds Damien had seen. Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled out his secondary encrypted satellite phone, the one only used for critical, immediate updates. He was supposed to watch, but what he had just witnessed required an exception. He called Damien Thorne, waking him from a brief, necessary sleep. "Mr. Thorne, this is Elias," he said, his voice flat and controlled despite the tension in his gut. "The subject is Alara 144B. I have confirmed the source of the injuries. A male subject, large build, driving a dark pickup, visited the residence between 12:30 and 1:20 a.m. There was confirmed physical contact and audible distress from the subject at 1:05 a.m. The male subject has a key. Damien Thorne listened on the other end, his heart rate dropping instantly as his mind went into full operational focus. He had expected to uncover a complex web of debt or obligation, but the truth was far simpler and far more vile. "He has a key," Damien repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "And you heard her distress. You are certain?" "Absolutely certain, sir. This is not casual conflict. This is abuse." A cold, hard fury settled over Damien. Ilara's silence was now fully justified. She wasn't just hiding a secret, she was trying to survive a personal siege. And the bastard had a key. "Elias," Damien commanded, his tone now a razor's edge. "Stay put. Don't move. She is vulnerable. If that man comes back, I want to know immediately. Get me the license plate and start a profile on him now. His routine, his associates, everything. And Elias." "Sir. Thank you for breaking the rules. Call me again in 1 hour. If you hear anything at all, you call me immediately. We move at dawn." As Elias disconnected, Damien Thorne threw back the covers and swung his legs onto the floor. Sleep was impossible now. He looked at the time, 1:30 a.m. He had seen the wounds, and now Elias had provided the name of the attacker, a man whose casual violence made Damien's own world of necessary evils look principled by comparison. Justice wasn't a slow-moving legal process for Damien Thorne. It was a matter of swift, decisive action. And he had a woman, battered and silent, who desperately needed the dark justice only he could provide. Elias was a patient man. The events of the previous night, the ugly thump, Ilara's muffled cry, had been a painful interruption to his professional detachment, but by morning he was back in his ghost mode. He knew the large man Garth was the danger, but Damien Thorne's orders were clear: gather all the facts. Abuse is rarely just physical. It's often a tangled web of control, and Damien wanted the whole picture. Ilara's next shift started early. She came out of the brownstone looking worse than before, moving stiffly with a new layer of exhaustion pulling her features tight. She was a woman trying to appear normal while carrying a secret that was heavier than any serving tray. Elias followed her to the corner bistro. He watched her work a punishing breakfast and lunch shift, the same mechanical efficiency, the same refusal to look anyone in the eye for too long. He noted how she meticulously separated her tips from her regular wages, counting the cash 3 times, folding it neatly and tucking it deep into a buttoned pocket of her apron. She was preparing a tax, a payment for her misery. The real pattern began to emerge in the evenings. Ilara would close the restaurant, clean her station until it gleamed, and be the last one out. But instead of walking straight home, she would take a detour to the back alley behind a dry cleaner's, a dimly lit spot hidden from the main street traffic. Elias watched from the mouth of the alley, pretending to be waiting for a bus that would never come. Punctually every night the dark, battered pickup truck would pull up. And every night Garth, the large man with the rough face, would be waiting. The first time Elias witnessed the exchange, his initial thought was that it might be a secretive, tense meeting between an estranged couple. But there was no warmth, no hug, not even a casual wave. Their interactions were short, sharp, and brutal in their coldness. Ilara would walk up to the truck, not slowly, but with the resigned haste of someone facing an unavoidable consequence. She never spoke first. Garth would lean against the doorframe of his truck, never inviting her closer. He would simply hold out his hand, palm up, in a gesture that wasn't a request, it was an expectation. On Tuesday night, Elias's camera, hidden discreetly in a nearby recycling bin, captured the full interaction. Ilara reached into her pocket and pulled out the painstakingly counted wads of cash, her tips and wages from the day. She didn't hesitate, but her fingers trembled as she placed the money into Garth's waiting, meaty hand. Garth didn't count it right away. He just looked at her, his eyes cold and assessing. He then slowly ran his thumb over the back of her hand, but it wasn't a caress. It was a subtle, controlling pressure. "Did Frank say anything?" Garth asked, his voice low and gravelly, the sound barely carrying to Elias. Ilara shook her head quickly. "No. Everything was normal. He just said I worked hard." "Good," Garth replied, finally pulling his hand and the money away. He stuffed the cash haphazardly into his own jacket pocket. Then he leaned in a little, his face close to hers, close enough for her to smell the stale cigarette smoke that always clung to him. "You remember what happens if you miss a night, right? Or if you talk to anyone?" Alara didn't answer with words. She simply looked down at the ground, her shoulders tightening. Her silence was a promise of compliance, a desperate acknowledgement of the unspoken threat. She was being coerced, not comforted. The lack of affection, the cold calculation in his eyes, the immediate financial demand, it all pointed to one thing. Garth had leverage, and her paycheck was merely the cost of her quiet survival. He wasn't her partner, he was her warden. He owned her ability to earn, and through that he owned her. As soon as the exchange was complete, Garth got back into his truck and drove off without a backward glance. Alara was left standing in the dark alley for a long moment, clutching her empty pocket, before she turned and started her weary walk toward the brownstone. Elias compiled the footage and the details for Damien Thorne. The picture was now complete. The man was not just an abuser. He was a controlling opportunist who was using physical violence and financial dependency to keep Alara trapped and silent. The next morning, Damien Thorne sat in his penthouse office, the city of Toronto, a massive complex sprawl outside his window. He wasn't looking at the skyline. He was looking at Elias's report, which was displayed on a large, secure tablet. The report was clinical. It detailed the nightly cash handover. It transcribed Garth's thinly veiled threats. It also provided the profile of Garth, whose full name was Garth "Brick" Harrison. A man with a history of petty crime, serious debt, and a nasty temper. He was a former heavy machine operator who was now mostly unemployed, living off Alara's constant stream of tips. The report confirmed that Garth was her former partner, using their shared past to maintain a reign of terror. Damien felt the cold, hard certainty solidify in his chest. This wasn't some legal gray area. This was a clear, disgusting case of a predator financially and physically breaking a woman. He looked at the freeze-frame image from the alley. Alara, small and defeated, handing over her hard-earned money to the large, uncaring man. Her vulnerability was stark. Her silence had cost her everything. "Justice is not blind when it comes to the weak," Damien murmured to himself. He contacted his lawyer and his security team. This situation required precision. He couldn't just have Garth disappear. Alara needed to be freed completely, and that included removing the psychological and financial chains that bound her. "Find me everything on Garth Harrison's debts," he commanded his financial analyst over the phone. "Every loan shark, every outstanding bill, every dime he owes." Then he turned to his head of security, a sharp, efficient woman named Anya. "Anya, I need a safe location. A small, anonymous apartment in a different city, say Hamilton. No digital footprint. Everything paid in advance, cash for a year." Finally, he picked up the small black business card he had given Alara. He ran his thumb over his name. He knew Alara wouldn't call him. Fear was too deeply ingrained. He had to be the one to make the move. Damien Thorne closed the report, the rage within him quiet and controlled. He had seen the wounds, witnessed the coercion, and understood the threat that lay behind her silence. Alara was right to be afraid, but her fear had now been officially noticed by a man who made fear disappear. He stood up, looking out over the indifferent city. The time for observation was over. The time for the order given without words had passed. It was time to give the order that would shatter Garth Harrison's control forever. He knew exactly what he had to do to guarantee Alara's safe future. The dawn was coming, and with it, a reckoning. The information gathered by Elias was now laid bare on Damien Thorne's desk. It wasn't just a tale of nightly cash handovers and occasional violence. It was a devastating portrait of systemic, strategic control. The truth that kept Alara quiet wasn't just a fear of physical pain, but a sophisticated terror woven into the fabric of her isolated life. Damien's financial team had been working through the night, tracing Garth Harrison's transactions, and the report they delivered was chilling. Garth wasn't using Alara's money to survive a rough patch. He was funding a small-time, failed lifestyle. He owed money to several low-level loan sharks, and more damningly, he was deliberately running up debt on the apartment where Alara lived. The apartment was technically in both their names from when they had been together years ago. Garth was refusing to pay his half of the expenses, letting the utility bills pile up and constantly threatening to default on the rent, which would get them both evicted and ruin Alara's credit history. He used this legal vulnerability as a chokehold. Every dollar Alara handed over was not just paying for Garth's beer and gambling. It was a bribe to keep the roof over her head from being pulled down by his sabotage. He had engineered a situation where her compliance was the only thing standing between her and utter homelessness. He created an anchor out of debt and fear, Damien noted to Anya, his security chief, who was standing ready. She can't leave because she loses her home. She can't report him because he'll ensure she loses her job, gets evicted, and then delivers on the physical threats. The report also detailed Garth's systematic isolation of Alara. He had forced her to change her phone number, blocked her on social media, and most cruelly had made an example of her only close friend, a former coworker named Chloe, whom he had verbally harassed and intimidated until Chloe felt forced to move out of the city entirely. Alara's world was the corner bistro, her walk home, and the brownstone where the threat slept with a key to her door. Her silence was not a sign of weakness. It was a carefully calculated strategy for survival against a strategic predator. That evening, Alara was even quieter than usual at the bistro. The constant thrum of fear was compounded by the memory of the large man kneeling beside her, his impossible question hanging in the air. She kept checking the time, waiting for the end of her shift, dreading the dark alley and the cash handover. She hadn't thrown away the black business card, though she'd almost burned it. It was still tucked into her wallet, a piece of dark magic promising rescue. As the restaurant emptied, the manager, Frank, came over looking uncomfortable. "Alara," he muttered, adjusting his tie. "I need to talk to you about your schedule. A customer complained that you looked unwell yesterday. You need to take the next 3 days off. Paid." Alara's heart seized. She felt panic rise instantly. "No, Frank, please. I'm fine. I can't take time off. I need the hours." "It's not a request, Alara," Frank said, not meeting her eye. He looked like he'd been forced into this conversation. "It's an order from a higher-up. I'll pay you for the shifts. Just don't come in tomorrow. Rest. I'll call you on Friday." Alara could barely breathe. This had to be Damien Thorne. He was pulling the first thread, and the entire fragile structure of her life was about to unravel. If she didn't work, she couldn't pay Garth. If she couldn't pay Garth, he would make their living situation unbearable, or worse, he would hurt her. She left the bistro in a daze, the panic making her movements clumsy. She didn't have her usual wage bundle. The fear was a physical weight on her chest. She didn't know that Damien's plan was already in motion. At the exact time Alara was supposed to be meeting Garth in the back alley, Garth was already out. He was sitting alone in a cheap, dimly lit bar near the city's industrial outskirts, waiting for Alara to arrive with the money. But tonight he wasn't alone for long. The bar door opened and 2 men walked in. They were large, quiet, and wore unremarkable dark coats. They didn't look like brawlers. They looked like highly paid professionals. Anya and another security specialist, both working for Damien. They walked straight to Garth's table. Garth, used to intimidating people, tried to glare them away. "You're making a mistake," he growled. Anya simply slid a plain manila envelope across the table. It wasn't money. It was paperwork. "This is the situation, Mr. Harrison," Anya said, her voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "The debt you owe to Salvatore and Associates? It's been purchased. The loan for your truck? Also purchased. The remaining lease agreement on the apartment at 144B? Purchased and settled." Garth's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear finally crossing his hard face. He grabbed the papers, flipping through them. The debts were real, his creditors were real, but the names of the buyers were all anonymous shell corporations. All leading back to Damien Thorne. "Who the hell are you?" Garth stammered. "We are just the messengers," the other man said, his voice deep. "You are now free of all your debt, Mr. Harrison. Every last penny. No more loan sharks, no more eviction threats. Your ledger is clean." Garth looked wildly around the bar. Sounded impossible. "What's the catch?" Anya leaned in, her eyes cold. "The catch is Alara. You walk away from her tonight. You never contact her again. You never speak her name. You never go back to that apartment. You take your truck and you disappear." Garth laughed, a nervous, hacking sound. "You think you can just buy me off? She's mine. I have a key, she does everything I say. She won't talk." Anya didn't raise her voice, but her next words were the most terrifying thing Garth had ever heard. She won't talk because you have threatened to destroy her life. We know about the financial sabotage. We know about the physical violence. Anya tapped the envelope. We also know that you violated your probation terms for a previous assault conviction last year. We know where you were last night at 1:05 a.m. The evidence is now in the hands of 3 different police departments across 3 different cities, ready to be filed. If you choose to contact Alara, even a text message, those files will be submitted immediately. You will go to jail for a very long time, Garth. If you walk away now, you are free and debtless. Garth Harrison finally saw the true scale of the man he was up against. This wasn't a vigilante. This was a force of nature. Damien Thorne hadn't broken the law. He had simply weaponized consequences against a man who thought he was untouchable. His control over Alara was built on lies and debt, and in one swift move, Damien Thorne had erased the debt and replaced the lies with undeniable, crushing truth. Garth's bravado crumpled. He was free of debt but trapped by his own crimes. He grabbed the envelope and shoved the chair back. He knew he was beaten. "Where is she?" he demanded, a last pathetic attempt at control. "She is safe," Anya replied, her eyes unyielding. "You don't need to worry about her anymore. She belongs to herself now." Garth stalked out of the bar. He got into his truck and sped away, forever severing the link between himself and Alara. Meanwhile, Alara was walking home, consumed by panic, clutching the black business card. She turned the key and opened her apartment door, braced for the inevitable violence that would follow her inability to pay. But the apartment was silent. It wasn't just silent, it felt different. The air was cleaner. There was a faint scent of fresh paint. The messy living room was immaculate. She walked slowly into the bedroom, her heart pounding. On the dresser was a simple, sealed envelope addressed to Alara. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a cashier's check, made out for 6 months of her living expenses, a new lease agreement in her name only, and a brief, typewritten letter. It wasn't from Damien Thorne, but the message was clear. Simply read, "All outstanding debts have been cleared. The apartment is yours for 1 year, paid in full. You are free to stay or go. Your only obligation now is to yourself. You deserve safety. P.S. There is an airline ticket to Hamilton in the smaller envelope. We recommend a fresh start." Alara sank onto her bed, the paper slipping from her grasp. It wasn't just money. It was her life back, delivered like a miracle by a quiet, forceful justice. She finally understood the true weight of the man who had knelt beside her. He hadn't demanded answers. He had simply provided a solution. She reached into her wallet and pulled out the black business card, holding it tightly. The tears came then, not of fear or pain, but of a shattering, overwhelming release. She wasn't free because she had fought her way out. She was free because someone, a stranger, a powerful force, had simply reached down and removed the chains. She looked around the room, which no longer felt like a cage but a sanctuary. Her exhaustion was still there, but beneath it lay an impossible, beautiful sense of peace. Justice hadn't been served by a judge. It had been delivered quietly, efficiently, and with immense care. She felt the tears turn to a smile. The silence that had once held her captive was now the silence of safety. The relief Alara felt was an ocean, vast and overwhelming. She was safe, she was paid, and the darkness that had held her captive for years was suddenly gone. She had packed a single bag, taken the provided ticket, and was now settling into a clean, small apartment in Hamilton, Ontario. A city far enough away to feel like a different world, yet close enough that the change felt real and manageable. She didn't know the exact mechanism of her freedom, only that it was powerful, quiet, and came from the man with the dark eyes and the intense, low voice, Damien Thorne. Back in Toronto, Damien Thorne was handling the final cleanup. He had ensured Alara was safely relocated and that Garth Harrison had been thoroughly, legally, and financially neutralized. Garth was free of debt but terrified of the legal consequences waiting for him if he ever dared to breathe Alara's name again. The mission was complete. Damien sat in his office, reviewing the final reports from Elias and his security team. The last piece of evidence was the surveillance footage from the dark alley, the video that showed the nightly cash handover. It was included for the legal record, to fully document the coercion and financial control Garth had wielded. Damien had intended to simply confirm the reports, file them away and move on. He started the video on his screen. He watched Alara walk up, her head bowed, her hand trembling as she passed the cash to the large man. He watched Garth's casual, brutal confidence. It was disgusting, but nothing he hadn't prepared for. Then, as the camera zoomed slightly to capture Garth's face when he leaned in to deliver his subtle, threatening lines, Damien froze. He leaned forward, hitting the pause button. He stared at the still image of Garth's rough, bearded face. The face of the abuser, the small-time tyrant, and a wave of intense, cold recognition washed over him. It wasn't just a familiar face. It was a ghost from a past Damien thought he had successfully buried. He hit the playback button, watching the man move, listening to the gravelly texture of his voice. There was no doubt. Garth Harrison, Damien murmured, the name tasting like dust and betrayal. It can't be. He immediately commanded his security chief, Anya, to pull up a file he hadn't accessed in years. A deeply archived set of documents related to the Scarlet incident from nearly a decade ago. It was a file marked with secrecy, involving several names that Damien had personally ensured were permanently removed from any public record. Anya, sensing the change in her boss's demeanor, the cold, rigid tension that indicated something far more dangerous than mere anger, worked quickly. She pulled the ancient file and brought up an old, grainy booking photo from a small-town police blotter. Damien pulled the photo next to the paused video feed of Garth Harrison. The hair was thinner in the old photo, the face slightly younger and cleaner shaven, but the bone structure, the cruel set of the jaw, the eyes. It was the same man. Garth Brick Harrison. Anya read from the old file's summary. Affiliation. Small-time associate of the Moretti crew, low-level enforcer. Mostly ran collections and beatings for gambling debts. Was arrested for a bar fight related to the Scarlet incident, but charges were dropped for lack of evidence. The name Moretti. The Scarlet incident. They were touchstones in Damien's memory, representing a very dark foundational moment in his rise to power. A moment where a young, innocent life had been tragically ruined because of the petty cruelties of men like Garth. Years ago, a young woman named Scarlet, who was loosely connected to Damien's organization, had been targeted by the Moretti crew. They had used intimidation and violence, trying to pressure her into giving up information. Garth Harrison, a nameless thug back then, had been one of the worst offenders, delighting in the fear he could instill. Damien, still finding his feet and learning the brutal rules of his world, had intervened too late. Scarlet had been terrified into making a desperate, irreversible choice, and the fallout had been catastrophic. The incident had cost Damien personally and professionally, and he had spent months systematically crushing the Moretti operation, ensuring every single person involved faced a reckoning. He had thought Garth Harrison was one of the names he had erased. He had pushed the memory down, classifying it as a painful, necessary lesson. And now, years later, the cruel face of one of the men responsible, one of the men he had failed to truly destroy, had reappeared, abusing another innocent woman. Damien's anger didn't explode. It crystallized into a terrifying, glacial resolve. The initial mission to save Alara had been driven by a simple sense of justice for the weak. This new discovery elevated the situation into something far more personal. A divine second chance to fix a past failure. He got away, Damien stated, his voice flat. He went quiet, disappeared, and came back to continue his pathetic pattern. He looked at Alara's file, the trembling hands, the hidden bruises, the terrified silence, and then back at Garth's smug face on the screen. Alara was suffering the consequences of a past wrong that Damien thought he had avenged. Anya, Damien commanded, his eyes still locked on the screen. We clean up our own mistakes. This is no longer just about Alara's safety. It's about ensuring Garth Harrison can never threaten anyone again. Not physically, not financially, and certainly not legally. Sir, the initial threat of turning him in should keep him silent, Anya cautioned gently. He's free of debt. He has no reason to come near Hamilton. The money we paid him for his debt is a leash, Damien countered. But a leash can be broken. A man like that only understands one thing, finality. He pulled up the records of Garth's cleared debts and smiled, but it was a cold, joyless expression. Contact the former owners of his debt, the loan sharks, Damien instructed. Tell them Garth Harrison has come into an unforeseen amount of liquidity. He is now good for the money he owes them, but he's been given a significant, untraceable lump sum payment from a highly secretive source. Inquire about the penalty for early repayment. Anya understood instantly. Garth thought he was free of debt. Damien was about to make him legally and financially vulnerable again. The loan sharks would see the opportunity to claim the settlement money Garth received, and they wouldn't stop until every penny of his past debt was fully collected. They wouldn't touch Alara, but they would hound Garth into oblivion, taking every dime Damien had used to clear him. This was finality. And the old arrest report from the Scarlet incident, Damien continued, leaning back in his chair. Find the one thing they couldn't nail him on, the smallest, most obscure violation. And make sure it lands on the desk of a judge who is known for having a zero-tolerance policy. Damien Thorne had done a good deed by saving Alara, but his motive was now twofold: to protect the present victim and to finally settle the score with the ghost of the past. He looked at the beautiful, quiet peace he had bought for Alara, and he knew it had to be protected by a deeper, harder, more permanent justice. He picked up his personal phone and called the number he had used to contact Alara's apartment earlier. A moment later, Alara's voice, small but steady, answered. "Hello. It's Damien Thorne," he said simply. "I am just calling to confirm you are settled in Hamilton." "Yes, Mr. Thorne," Alara whispered. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life." Damien heard the genuine gratitude, the raw emotion in her voice. It was heartwarming, and it was the only proof he needed that he had done the right thing. "You don't need to thank me, Alara," he said, his voice softer than he usually allowed it to be. "Just use this chance. Build a good life. You deserve peace." He hung up, the feeling of justice finally served settling over him like a heavy cloak. He had done the right thing for Alara, ensuring her future was free of fear, and in doing so he had corrected a forgotten mistake of his past. The past was settled, and the future for one brave waitress was now bright. Alara was gone. She was settled in Hamilton, her life suddenly quiet and strangely empty without the constant gnawing presence of fear and the exhausting grind of the double shifts. The bistro felt different without her, quieter, with a small hole in the frantic rhythm of the service. Damien Thorne knew she was safe, and the legal and financial hammer was already falling on Garth Harrison, ensuring he could never bother her again. The mission was accomplished. However, something restless lingered in Damien. He felt an urge to see her, not to confirm her safety. He knew she was safe, but perhaps to look into the eyes of the woman he had saved and finally put the ghost of the past to rest completely. So one late Wednesday afternoon, Damien returned to the corner bistro. He arrived alone, without the usual security detail, blending as much as a man of his presence could. He sat down at his old corner booth, ordered his black coffee and waited. He knew she wasn't working the lunch rush, but he had a feeling. He watched the door, waiting for the familiar, slightly slumped figure to appear. He waited for over an hour. Finally, the manager, Frank, rushed over, looking utterly terrified. "Mr. Thorne, sir. I'm so sorry. You called in advance, but I forgot to tell you, Alara isn't working here anymore. She resigned. Moved away." Frank wrung his hands. "I thought you knew. I thought you arranged it." Damien felt a flicker of surprise. He had paid her to take time off, but he hadn't expected her to quit entirely. She took the opportunity, he thought. Good. Just as he was about to stand up and leave, Frank's phone rang. Frank answered, spoke for a moment, and then his eyes widened as he held the phone out to Damien. "Sir, it's her. Alara. She saw your name pop up on my caller ID when you were making the reservation this morning. She's asking for you." Damien took the phone. "Alara, it's Damien Thorne. I'm surprised you called. Why did you go back to the bistro?" Her voice was steady, but edged with a sharp, controlled anger that was entirely new to him. It was the voice of a woman who had finally found her boundaries. "I went to confirm you were settled and safe," he admitted. "And to see if you needed anything else. I need you to leave me alone." Her words hit him with the force of a slap. He leaned back in the booth, his voice remaining measured, patient. "Alara, I've given you freedom. Your abuser is neutralized. Your debts are cleared. You are free. I just want to make sure no one else comes looking for you." "And what then?" she challenged. "You'll stand guard over my apartment in Hamilton? You'll be my personal protection detail for the rest of my life? Because that's what this is, isn't it?" Her voice grew louder, the fear replaced by a desperate, wounded accusation. "You didn't just save me, Mr. Thorne. You bought me a life, and you expect me to be grateful and compliant. You think because I took your money and your plane ticket, I owe you silence and obedience. Damien listened, his expression softening as he understood the source of her anger. She was terrified of exchanging one master for another. For a decade she had been controlled by an abusive man who used leverage and money. Now a more powerful man had stepped in using greater leverage and more money. To her the dynamic felt terrifyingly familiar. Elara, I understand what you are feeling, Damien said quietly. But you owe me nothing. You owe yourself peace. So, I don't want your obedience and I don't want your silence. I want you to be safe enough to find your voice again. Then stop looking for me, she cried. Stop using Frank to check on me. I took the ticket. I left. My life is mine now. And if you show up here in Hamilton or send one of your men, I will call the police and tell them exactly what a powerful man like you can do to someone who just wants to be left alone. The threat was empty, but the emotion behind it was raw and real. She was fighting for her autonomy and she was fighting against a lifetime of being controlled by men who mistook help for ownership. Damien felt a wave of profound respect. The tired, fearful waitress was gone. This woman was a survivor with a backbone of steel. You have my word, Elara, he said, and his voice was completely sincere. I will not pursue you. I will not contact you. I came to the bistro only to ensure no stragglers from your past life were still looking for you. They are not. You are completely untraceable and safe. He paused, letting the silence settle between them. I offer you one final thing and I expect you to refuse it, but you should know it's there. My offer was not meant to buy you. I simply saw injustice and corrected it. If in 6 months, a year or a decade you find yourself truly needing a friend or needing protection, that black card is still active. That is a promise with no price attached. She was silent for a long time on the other end, the air heavy with her doubt and her dawning realization that he meant it. He wasn't demanding anything, he was giving her back her right to choose. Finally she let out a shaky breath, the anger dissolving into a residual, deep exhaustion. Goodbye, Mr. Thorne, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Goodbye, Elara. I wish you well. He hung up the phone and handed it back to a bewildered Frank, who stared at him as if he were an alien. Damien Thorne rose from the booth, his mission finally complete. The initial anger that drove him had long dissolved into quiet satisfaction. He had not only saved an innocent woman, but in doing so he had faced down a piece of his own painful past. He walked out of the bistro and into the Toronto street, feeling lighter than he had in years. Elara's fury, her defiant rejection of his help, was the most heartwarming thing he could have heard. It was proof that he hadn't just removed a threat. He had restored her will. She wasn't an object of rescue anymore. She was a free woman standing on her own, strong enough to reject even the hand that saved her. That night, alone in her new quiet apartment, Elara looked at the black business card. She didn't throw it away. She tucked it into the lining of her jewelry box. It wasn't a marker of control. It was an invisible safety net, a promise of hope from an impossible source. For the first time she was truly safe, and the future, simple and entirely her own, was ready for her to build. The air in the staff room of the corner bistro was still thick with tension long after Damien Thorne had left. Elara sat on the milk crate, the black business card resting beside her, a heavy, unsettling presence. She had managed to convince Frank, the manager, to let her walk out early, claiming she felt too sick to continue the shift. Frank, still reeling from the sudden commanding appearance of the city's silent power broker, simply nodded and told her to take the time she needed. But walking out wasn't freedom, it was panic. Elara felt the intense burning urge to flee this whole situation, but every instinct she possessed, honed by years of coercion, screamed at her to return to the known structure of her pain. She couldn't accept the money. She couldn't accept the help. Because in her world help always came with a hidden price. Damien Thorne, despite his soft voice and earnest eyes, was still a powerful man who had just used his influence to meddle with her life. He was trading her physical and emotional pain for a debt of silence, a debt of gratitude, a debt she couldn't afford to pay. She stood up abruptly, her bruised arm protesting the movement. She snatched up the black card, walked over to the garbage can and paused, her hand shaking. Throwing it away felt like throwing away a lifeline, but keeping it felt like signing a contract with the devil. She made her choice. She walked out of the staff room, ignored Frank's concerned gaze, and stepped out onto the busy Toronto street. Instead of heading toward the comfort of her familiar, fearful route home, she walked in the opposite direction, toward the central subway station. She was choosing to run, choosing the sheer physical risk of being out on the street over the indebted safety offered by Damien. She needed to put physical space between herself and his overwhelming, controlling generosity. She walked for blocks, her pace quickening into a panicked jog. She felt like she had just escaped an expensive cage only to realize she was now naked and exposed in the wilderness. The truth of her situation settled on her. She had no support system, no savings, and the moment Garth found out she had missed her payment and her job, the consequences would be brutal. Her defiant choice felt less brave and more suicidal. Damien Thorne was in his car 10 blocks away, already receiving the initial frantic reports from his team. "She left the bistro, Mr. Thorne. She didn't go home. She's heading toward the city center, moving fast," reported the security detail he had quietly assigned to watch her until she was settled. Damien frowned. He had expected her to be wary but not to bolt. Her actions were reckless, defying the calculated safety he had provided. "Which way is she going?" "She's almost at Union Station, sir." "She looks frantic." Union Station was a hub of chaos and crowds, the worst place for an unprotected, vulnerable person to run. If she got lost in the flow, she would be untraceable. And if Garth was watching, this sudden break in routine made her an easy, vulnerable target. Damien made a decision that broke one of his longest-standing professional rules. Never personally engage a subject unless absolutely necessary for threat neutralization. His initial intervention had been controlled and distant. This would be neither. "Marcus," he commanded his driver, his voice sharp. "Ditch the security escort. Take me to Union Station now. Fast as you can." He grabbed a plain, unidentifiable black jacket from the seat next to him, shedding the formal suit coat that marked him as the powerful crime lord. He was going after her himself. The need to find her wasn't driven by the rational planning of a boss, but by the raw, gut-level fear that she was about to undo everything he had put in motion. He didn't just see a stray witness. He saw a repetition of the past, a desperate good woman running toward a catastrophe he knew how to prevent. The Scarlet Incident. The memory of that failed rescue was a burning coal in his chest. He would not fail this time. When Damien found her, Alara was already inside the sprawling station, caught in the current of rush-hour travelers. She was standing near a ticket machine, tears streaming down her face, fumbling with her wallet, clearly trying to buy a ticket to anywhere, to escape. She looked completely lost, small and terribly alone. Damien moved through the crowd, his gaze locked on her, his size and sheer presence parting the flow of commuters. "Alara," he called out, his voice loud enough to cut through the noise, yet still retaining its deep, commanding rumble. She spun around, her eyes wide, recognizing him instantly. The sight of him, his intense gaze and the power he radiated didn't bring relief. It brought the very panic she was trying to escape. "No. Stay away from me," she yelled, her voice breaking. She stumbled backward, bumping into a large suitcase. Damien reached her in 2 long strides, his hand closing gently around her arm, the unbruised one. "Stop. You are not safe here," he said, pulling her slightly into the calmer space near a pillar. "You are acting recklessly. What are you doing?" Alara yanked her arm back, her face contorted with anger and fear. "I am walking away from you. From the deal. I'd rather face him than be owned by you. You are just another powerful man who wants to control my life with money. I am not yours to fix." Her words, full of raw fury and defiance, hit Damien like a punch. They weren't just accusations. They were the terrified screams of a woman who had been trapped too long. She had misunderstood everything. She had seen his help not as benevolence, but as the first step of a new, more gilded form of captivity. "I am not interested in controlling you," Damien said, his voice low and intense. "I am interested in ensuring that a monster doesn't destroy you. That man, Garth Harrison, he has a history. A pattern. He is tied to a mistake I made years ago that cost an innocent woman her life, Alara. A mistake I never knew survived." He took a careful step back, giving her space, letting the raw confession hang in the air. He was laying his cards bare, admitting a profound personal failure to this woman he barely knew. "You are not a deal, Alara. You are a second chance. My failure to deal with that type of cruelty completely years ago is why you are standing here, bruised and terrified. I cannot let that happen again. The intensity in his eyes, the sincere pain in his voice, finally pierced through her panic. She saw not the cold, powerful crime lord, but a man wrestling with a conscience he thought was dead. The confession shattered her preconceived notion that he was simply a predator looking for a new victim. Her anger drained away, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion and confusion. She looked around the chaotic station, then back at Damien, who was standing there jacketless, exposed and vulnerable in a way a man like him should never be. I can't go back to the apartment, she whispered, shaking her head. He'll find me. He'll be angry that I walked out. He won't, Damien promised. The apartment is dealt with and Garth is gone. But you cannot be on the street. Come with me now. I will take you somewhere safe, not as your keeper, but as someone ensuring your safe journey to Hamilton. You take your plane ticket, you start your new life, and you never look back. We never speak again. He held out his hand, an offering of safe passage, not ownership. Alara stared at his hand. It was a massive hand, a hand that could destroy things, but right now, it was simply extended in a silent promise of protection. She was choosing between the terrifying empty road of reckless freedom and the safe, enclosed path offered by a man who had just admitted a profound, haunting failure. She took a shaky breath, the tears finally subsiding. Her exhausted body and desperate heart made the choice for her. She reached out and placed her small, trembling hand in his large, warm one. Hamilton, she murmured, accepting the journey, and with it, the undeniable, complicated hope he represented. Damien Thorne had honored his promise. He hadn't put Alara on a plane. He had personally driven her out of Toronto in a quiet, unmarked car, with Marcus behind the wheel and Anya following discreetly a few miles behind. The drive was silent, respectful. He didn't press her for details, only ensured she was calm and comfortable. He drove her straight to the anonymous, clean apartment in Hamilton, handed her the keys and the check, and then left, adhering strictly to her demand for complete space. For 2 days, Damien focused on ensuring the net around Garth Harrison was tightening. The financial leverage had worked. The loan sharks, alerted to Garth's sudden liquidity, the money Damien used to clear his debt, were now circling, demanding immediate penalty payments. Garth was being hounded by his own past, courtesy of Damien's quiet strategy. He was broke, terrified, and on the run. Damien was confident the problem was solved. Garth was neutralized, his financial and criminal history ensuring he would never be a public threat again. He was finished. Then the problem refused to stay buried. Elias the Watcher was meticulous. He reported that Garth had vanished from the known periphery of Toronto. No truck, no known associates, no signs of life. This should have been the end of the story, Garth hiding under a rock. But Elias's final report shattered Damien's sense of completion. The Lucetti family. They weren't Damien's immediate rivals, but they were a powerful, aggressive syndicate operating heavily in the Great Lakes region, constantly looking for ways to expand their influence into Damien's Canadian territory. He ran to the competition, Damien stated flatly, running a hand over his jaw as he stared at the report on his screen. The betrayal was less surprising than the sheer stupidity of the move. The report continued. Garth hadn't run to them for simple protection. He was offering a trade. Garth Harrison, knowing he was being hunted by an unseen, terrifying power, Damien, was selling information about his pursuer to the Lucetti crew in exchange for guaranteed immunity and a stake in their operations. What information could a low-level thug like Garth possibly have? Anya answered the question before Damien even asked it. She laid a satellite photo on the desk. A clear, detailed image of Garth sitting across a table from a man known to be Lucetti's second-in-command, a notoriously ruthless strategist named Marco. Garth's not offering names of our crew, sir, Anya explained, pointing to the image. He's offering 2 things, leverage on you and names from the past. Garth had worked under the Moretti crew, the syndicate Damien had dismantled years ago after the Scarlet incident. Garth had been privy to the internal affairs and dirty secrets of that organization. Secrets Damien had worked hard to ensure were permanently buried. He's not selling our present, Damien realized, his voice dangerously low. He's trying to drag up my past. The fear wasn't that Garth would reveal where Damien's legitimate businesses were. The fear was that he would expose the methods and people Damien had used to destroy the Moretti crew. This kind of information could destabilize Damien's entire network, and more importantly, it could put people who trusted Damien years ago back in the crosshairs. And the worst possible piece of leverage? Garth could reveal that Damien had intervened personally in Alara's life. The Lucetti family would recognize the pattern immediately. A powerful, quiet boss breaking his own rules for a small, defenseless woman. They would realize that Alara was Damien's vulnerability, his sentimental weakness. They would know exactly where to strike to hurt him, not financially but personally by targeting the woman he had just sworn to protect. This is no longer a cleanup operation, Anya, Damien said, standing up, his large frame radiating controlled fury. This is a direct declaration of war, using an innocent woman as the bait. He looked at the satellite photo of Garth, smug and desperate across from the Lucetti strategist. Garth Harrison thinks he is trading up for immunity. He thinks he's free. He's about to find out he just traded the frying pan for the fire. Damien picked up his secure satellite phone. He didn't call Elias for more surveillance. He called his field commanders. Prepare the teams. Immediate mobilization. Detroit is off-limits territory, but we are making a surgical entry, he ordered. The target is Garth Harrison. He is to be neutralized and removed from the equation before he finishes his pitch. I don't care about the Lucetti family right now. My priority is silencing this past that refuses to stay buried, before it puts Alara's future in danger. He had saved Alara, sending her to Hamilton to find peace. But Garth, in his desperate attempt to survive, had forced Damien to realize that peace could never be guaranteed while his cruel ghost still walked. Damien now had to move faster, harder, and more violently than he had originally planned, all to ensure that the fragile hope he had built for Alara didn't crumble under the weight of his own complicated history. He thought of Alara, safe and alone in Hamilton, already suspicious of his motives. He thought she was free. Damien knew he had to keep fighting the battle she didn't even know was happening, so her silence and her safety would be truly permanent this time. The clock was ticking in a terrifying new way. Garth Harrison hadn't just run. He had defected, turning himself into a toxic piece of leverage for the Lucetti syndicate. Damien Thorne knew that every moment Garth spent talking was a direct threat to the safety of everyone Damien cared about, including the one person he was trying to save, Alara. Damien didn't need to wait for a full report to know the damage was already being done. Within 24 hours of Elias's Detroit sighting, Damien's carefully controlled territory started to feel the subtle, surgical pressure of the Lucetti family. It began with small things that felt too coincidental to be random. A shipment of goods scheduled to cross the border was intercepted by Canadian border officials, acting on an anonymous tip about paperwork anomalies that only an insider would know. Then a legitimate high-value property deal that Damien was closing fell apart when the seller suddenly pulled out, citing obscure, highly specific legal risks that mirrored conversations Damien had had years ago during the Moretti conflict. These weren't brute force attacks. They were pinpricks designed to confuse, disrupt, and most importantly whisper a message: we know things we shouldn't. Damien sat with Anya, reviewing the timeline of the disruptions. They're using the old Moretti playbook, Anya observed, pointing at the property deal. They know the pressure points we used against Moretti, and they're using Garth's knowledge to reverse engineer them against us. And they haven't touched anything vital yet, Damien added, his voice low and cold. They are testing the strength of the ice before they commit their full weight. They want to see how far we will bend. But the most insidious attack came closer to home. Frank, the nervous manager at the corner bistro, received a threatening, anonymous phone call demanding information about the waitress who ran. Frank, terrified, immediately called Damien's office. The Lucetti family didn't care about Frank. They wanted to know if Alara was still connected to Damien. They were confirming their leverage, using Garth's knowledge to zero in on Damien's newfound vulnerability. They are looking for her, Damien confirmed, running a hand over the map of the border region. Garth told them enough to know Alara is the key, the final thread holding this whole old crime together. The old crime wasn't just the abuse. It was the entire history of the Moretti operation and Damien's violent intervention. Garth was using Alara's rescue as proof of Damien's weakness. Proof that he would go to extraordinary lengths to protect an innocent. To the Lucetti family, Alara was simply the most effective bomb they could detonate against their rival. The risk of her safety, even hidden in Hamilton, was now critical. Garth's immunity pitch must have been convincing, Damien said. He must have promised them something enormous to warrant this much attention. He promised them you, Mr. Thorne, Anya replied simply. He promised them the way to hurt you where you don't expect it, through your conscience. Damien realized the full, terrifying scope of his intervention. When he saved Alara, he had not only righted a past wrong but had inadvertently created the perfect target for his current enemies. Alara was no longer just a victim of domestic abuse. She was an unwilling, vital witness to a crime from the past, a symbol of Damien's operational weakness, and the unwitting spark for a major conflict. We move tonight, Damien decided, the planning phase over. A surgical team. We are not negotiating with Lucetti, and we are not giving them time to solidify their hold on Garth. He knew that if the Lucetti family could get concrete evidence, a name, a file, a testimony, of Damien's past methods, they could use it to cripple his entire organization, allowing them to sweep into his territory unopposed. And all of that leverage was currently sitting in Garth Harrison's mouth. Damien stood up, pulling on his travel coat. I need to contact Alara. Anya frowned. Sir, with all due respect, that is exactly what they are waiting for. Any contact risks revealing her location. I know, Damien admitted. But she is alone and vulnerable, fearing both the man who hurt her and the man who saved her. She thinks I abandoned her after our last conversation. If Lucetti makes a move, she needs to know what she's facing, and she needs to know who is coming for her. He stepped into a secure, soundproof office and initiated a call to the burner phone he had left for Alara in her Hamilton apartment, the one she was only supposed to use in an emergency. In Hamilton, Alara answered on the second ring, her voice tight with immediate fear. Mr. Thorne. Alara, listen to me. This is important. Are you alone? Yes, she whispered. I've been okay. I haven't called anyone. Why are you calling? I told you. I know what you told me, Damien interrupted gently. But the man who hurt you, Garth Harrison, he is trying to use your situation against me. He went to my rivals. They are looking for you, Alara. Not because you are valuable but because you are my weakness. Her silence was heavy. She finally understood the full, terrifying gravity of the man who had knelt beside her in the bistro. Her personal battle had just become a war. What do I do? She asked, her voice shaking but resolute. The fear was there, but so was a thread of hard-won strength. You stay exactly where you are. You do not leave that apartment for any reason. Do not talk to anyone. I am mobilizing now. This fight is not yours, but I will end it and I will ensure your peace is permanent. I broke my rule to call you because I needed you to know I have not abandoned you. I am coming for the threat, Alara, not for you. He could hear her taking a deep, shuddering breath. I believe you, Mr. Thorne. Thank you. It was a small, fragile moment of trust forged in the heat of a looming conflict. Damien ended the call. He had given her hope and assurance. Now he had to deliver on his promise. He was heading into hostile territory, sparked by a whisper of betrayal, all for the sake of a quiet waitress and a mistake he refused to let survive. The war for Alara's freedom was about to begin in the cold streets of Detroit. In her small, anonymous apartment in Hamilton, Alara listened to the dial tone fade, her entire body shaking. The call from Damien Thorne had felt like a lightning strike, illuminating the dark truth she had carried for years. Her personal tragedy wasn't random, it was orchestrated. She walked over to the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction. The world outside looked peaceful, ordinary. But she knew a storm was raging miles away. A storm sparked by her life, her silence, and the cruel greed of Garth Harrison. Damien Thorne had mentioned an old crime, and a mistake he never knew survived. The pieces, terrifying and jagged, finally clicked together in Alara's mind. She remembered the beginning of the abuse years ago when she and Garth were barely dating. It wasn't the physical violence that started it, but the sudden, intense focus Garth had put on her job and her routine. Back then she hadn't been a waitress. She had been a cleaner at a high-end, exclusive art gallery that often hosted private, late-night auctions for wealthy clients. She remembered one night vividly. She was working late, cleaning the empty gallery floor when she saw Garth, who was supposed to be at a friend's place, arguing heatedly with two large, unfamiliar men in the alleyway outside the delivery entrance. They weren't fighting, they were talking low, urgently, and they looked angry. She hadn't heard much, only bits and pieces. Moretti, payment schedule, and "Don't mess this up, Brick." The men had looked up and Garth, startled, had quickly pulled her back inside, his face pale with fury. That was the night everything changed. The next morning, Garth had been strangely agitated. Within the week the threats started. Not just financial coercion but constant verbal drills, telling her exactly what to say if anyone, especially anyone asking about the gallery, ever talked to her. "You saw nothing, Alara. You know nothing. You only clean," he'd whispered, his eyes cold and menacing. "If you ever mention the name Moretti or what you saw that night, I will make your life a living nightmare. And I won't just hurt you, I'll destroy everything you touch." She had been terrified into absolute silence, believing the threat was meant to protect Garth from the two men he was arguing with. Now, years later, armed with the horrifying context provided by Damien Thorne, Alara realized the sickening truth. Garth hadn't been hiding his own crime. He had been protecting a lie built on blood. Garth's abuse, his financial control, his isolation of her. It had all been a sophisticated, long-term strategy to ensure her silence, keeping her trapped and terrified, thus protecting himself from the consequences of what she had unknowingly witnessed. Her suffering was the collateral damage of a criminal cover-up. Alara sat down on the edge of her bed, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal paralyzing her. She had endured years of pain, thinking she was protecting herself from a monster. But her silence had actually been protecting Garth and his criminal associates, preventing the truth about their activities from surfacing. She realized the irony was unbearable. Damien Thorne, the Mafia boss, had intervened not just out of kindness, but to clean up a bloody mess connected to the very syndicate that had caused her initial terror. Alara wasn't just a victim, she was the living evidence, the woman at the center of the storm, who could prove Garth's deep ties to a dismantled crime organization. Now, with Garth running to Lucetti, her silence had become a commodity, a secret to be traded for immunity. And that put her in the crosshairs of two powerful warring factions. A feeling of cold, hard resolve settled over her. She was done being the silent victim, the unwilling witness, the convenient shield. She had been used, abused, and betrayed, all for the sake of a lie. She walked over to her small desk and picked up the black business card. Damien Thorne had told her he was fighting for the threat, not for her. But Alara knew that if she could help him silence the past, she could finally secure her future. She looked at the number on the card. She needed to contact him. Not to ask for help but to offer leverage. She took a deep breath, the air in her lungs feeling clean and sharp for the first time. She would tell him about the gallery, about the specific names and threats Garth had made her swear never to speak. She would give him the evidence he needed to destroy Garth Harrison once and for all, ensuring the Lucetti family could never use her secret to hurt the man who was now risking everything for her peace. She dialed the number. "Mr. Thorne, this is Alara," she said, her voice steady and clear. The years of fear were finally breaking away. "I know things about Garth's past. Things he made me promise never to say. I know what he's offering Lucetti. I can give you the names. I can give you the truth you need to end this." She was no longer running. She was fighting. And in her newfound, clear voice, she had just offered the most valuable currency in the entire conflict. The truth that could rewrite history and finally secure her peace. The moment Alara spoke those words, "I can give you the truth you need to end this," Damien Thorne knew the stakes had changed. She was no longer a civilian needing rescue, but a crucial player offering vital intelligence in a war she hadn't started. He was deep in the final planning stages for the Detroit operation, sitting in a secured command center near the border. He put the call on speaker, gesturing for Anya to listen closely. "What information do you have, Alara?" Damien asked, his voice calm, encouraging her newfound resolve. Alara recounted everything. The late-night cleaning job at the gallery, the urgent, hushed argument she'd witnessed in the alley, the specific names, Moretti, Brick, and the sudden, immediate shift in Garth's behavior that led to the abuse. She explained how her silence wasn't fear of him, but fear of exposing Garth's ties to the dismantled crime organization. "He used my fear of him to cover up his fear of you," Alara concluded, the realization making her voice tremble slightly. "He was protecting himself from the consequences of what I saw, and he used me to do it." The information was explosive. The art gallery was a known spot for high-value, discreet transactions. Garth wasn't just a low-level thug. He had likely been guarding a major transfer of assets for Moretti. If the Lucetti family had this testimony, they could prove Damien's intervention in the Moretti crew years ago was not just territorial, but personally motivated and highly illegal. It would give them the evidence to launch criminal investigations that could bring down his legitimate empire. Damien knew what he had to do. The Detroit operation was designed to be quick and clean. Neutralize Garth, cut the flow of information and restore the balance. That was the strategic choice. But Alara's voice, her raw vulnerability and the knowledge that he was the reason she was in danger again. A victim in a war he had started, forced a change in priority. The strategic choice would guarantee his empire's stability, but it put Alara at continued risk from the Lucetti family, who now knew she was his only weakness. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His entire empire was built on a foundation that allowed the weak to be exploited, and his weakness was his refusal to accept that exploitation. He had to choose between preserving his vast, powerful empire, or committing fully to saving the one woman whose pain exposed his deepest, weakest point. "Anya," Damien commanded, his eyes fixed on the map but his mind already set. "The Detroit operation is aborted." Anya gasped. "Sir? Aborted? Lucetti already knows too much. We have to secure Garth and the information now before they move into our territory." "We can't," Damien said, his voice hard. "If we hit Lucetti in Detroit, we provoke a full-scale border war. Lucetti will retaliate against the one thing he knows is unprotected, Alara. He will use her as a hostage or worse, as a final piece of testimony." He walked over to a secure communications console, a complex device used for high-level, sensitive transactions. "The board changes now," Damien stated. "We turn the war inward." He began issuing orders that made Anya's eyes widen in disbelief. "But sir," Anya argued, "that exposes our involvement in the Moretti cleanup. It risks internal investigations and puts targets on the backs of half the people who work for you." "I am aware," Damien replied, his face grim. "But it also gives the police a powerful, clear narrative. Garth Harrison, a man with a history of domestic violence, was covering up his involvement in a serious crime for the Moretti syndicate. His victim, Alara, is now providing critical, compelling testimony. If we frame it that way, the police focus on Garth's crimes and Alara's victimhood. Lucetti will be forced to abandon Garth, because backing a known abuser and fugitive witness will burn them with law enforcement and ruin their carefully cultivated legitimate fronts." Damien was choosing the long, agonizing process of legal and financial exposure over the quick, violent fix. He was intentionally creating chaos inside his own territory to force his rivals to retreat, all to ensure Alara's safety and silence the past once and for all. "Alara is the priority," Damien reaffirmed, looking at Anya, his commitment absolute. "Her safety is the only acceptable outcome. The empire can be rebuilt. An innocent life cannot be recovered." He picked up the phone to call Alara back, knowing he needed one more thing from her, a risk he couldn't take without her full consent. "Alara," he said when she answered, "I need you to be ready. I am sending people to secure your testimony and get a statement from you. This is going to be messy and the press may get involved. You will be exposed, but only temporarily. Are you ready to speak the truth you've been forced to keep silent?" "Yes," Alara replied instantly, her voice strong and clear. "I am done being silent, Mr. Thorne. I will tell them everything." Damien closed his eyes briefly. The choice was made. He was sacrificing years of careful work, tearing down his own safe walls, but he was doing it to give Alara the ultimate justice, a life free from the ghosts of his own past mistakes. He was choosing humanity over empire. The board was broken, but Alara was safe, and that was the only victory that mattered. Alara's life in Hamilton was no longer quiet. The process of giving her testimony was intense. Damien Thorne's legal team descended on her apartment, not with lawyers, but with compassionate, highly professional investigators who spent hours meticulously cataloging the years of abuse, the financial coercion, and most importantly, the exact details of the night she saw Garth Harrison with the Moretti associates in the alley. Her statement, detailed and devastating, became the legal balm Damien needed. By providing law enforcement with clear evidence of Garth's ties to serious, decades-old crimes, they successfully shifted the official focus entirely onto Garth. The Lucetti family's leverage dissolved overnight. They couldn't risk being publicly associated with a fugitive abuser who was now a primary suspect in a major criminal investigation. The war was turning against Garth, exactly as Damien had planned. But while the outside world was loud, Ilara's apartment remained her sanctuary, thanks to the constant, discreet presence of Damien's security detail posted blocks away. One evening, after she had completed her final deposition, the doorbell rang. It was late. Ilara hesitated, but the security agent at the front gate had cleared the visitor. She opened the door to find Damien Thorne standing there alone. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit. He wore a plain dark sweater and looked tired, the weight of the war he had just turned inward etched on his face. "I need 5 minutes, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet, lacking any of its usual commanding tone. "I owe you a truth that is not in any of those files." She stepped aside, letting him in. She didn't feel afraid. She felt a strange, quiet connection to this man who had sacrificed so much for her. He didn't sit. He stood by the window looking out at the Hamilton night, his back to her. "The night you saw Garth in that alley, the names you heard, Moretti, Brick, that was not just a small deal," Damien began, his voice rough. "It was the beginning of the end for the Moretti syndicate. And I was the one who ended it." Ilara's breath hitched, but she remained silent, urging him to continue. "Years ago, the Moretti crew targeted someone I cared about, a woman who was good and who was used by them. When I found out, I moved. I destroyed their entire operation. I made sure every single person involved paid a price, financially and professionally. That was my justice." He finally turned to face her, his eyes holding a deep, profound sorrow. "But I was sloppy, or perhaps too focused on the big picture. Garth Harrison, Brick, was one of the low-level thugs I thought I had neutralized, one of the names I filed away as handled. He disappeared and I assumed he was gone forever." Damien took a step closer, his gaze steady on hers. "Your suffering, Ilara, was not random. It was the result of my mistake. Garth targeted you not just because you saw him, but because he saw a chance to hide in plain sight, using you as his shield. He kept you silent, and his freedom was my failure." He paused, the confession hanging between them, heavy and devastating. "When I knelt beside you in the bistro and saw those wounds, I didn't just see a victim of abuse," Damien confessed. "I saw the consequences of a past crime I thought I had settled. I didn't just save you to be kind, I saved you because I had a debt to pay. The mistake I never knew survived was standing right in front of me, and I had to destroy it." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer an excuse. He simply laid his moral ledger bare, allowing her to see the bloodstains on his hands. "I have sacrificed significant parts of my organization, destroyed alliances, and exposed myself legally to ensure that Garth is permanently neutralized, and that no rival can ever use your past to hurt you again. This is not for a contract, Ilara. This is my apology to you for being the reason your life was ruined." The power in the room, which had always been so weighted toward him, the protector, the rich man, the boss, suddenly and completely shifted. He was no longer the imposing figure. He was just a man admitting a profound, painful failure. Ilara looked at him. She saw the powerful man who could dismantle empires, but she also saw the genuine remorse of a man who cared about the innocent blood spilled in his shadow. "You said you had a debt to pay," Ilara said softly, stepping toward him. "You paid it. You didn't just pay it with money. You paid it by giving up your power, by taking on a danger you didn't have to, and by telling me the truth." She reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. She felt the warmth of his skin beneath the sweater and the rock-solid tension in his muscles. "You didn't have to tell me this, Mr. Thorne," she murmured. "But you did. You didn't just free me from Garth. You freed me from the lie I was protecting. And that is more than justice. That is honesty." For the first time since she collapsed on the bistro floor, the burden of her past felt truly lifted. The confession hadn't made her cry. It made her feel strong, validated, and seen in a way she never had been before. "Thank you, Damien," she said, using his first name for the first time, a small, intimate gesture of equality. Damien looked down at her hand on his arm, the unexpected comfort and forgiveness in her touch a foreign sensation. He nodded slowly, accepting her gratitude, accepting her understanding. He had come to confess his past. He was leaving with a profound sense of peace. "Your safety is secured, Ilara. I won't interfere again. Live the life you deserve." He turned and walked toward the door. As he left the apartment, closing the door softly behind him, Elara watched him go. She was no longer defined by her wounds or her silence. She was defined by her strength and her future. The power had shifted completely. She was free, and in giving her that freedom, Damien Thorn had finally found a measure of redemption. Months turned into a year. Elara was no longer the small, fearful woman who cleaned tables and counted tips with trembling hands. She was a paralegal student, confident and self-assured, thriving in the quiet, steady rhythm of her new life in Hamilton. Her past was a scar, fully healed and no longer defining her present. One crisp autumn Saturday, Elara made a pilgrimage. She drove back to Toronto not out of necessity but out of choice. She had no intention of going back to the brownstone, but she had one destination in mind: the corner bistro. She walked in just after the noon rush, and the restaurant looked exactly the same. The cozy brick walls, the clatter of silverware, the smell of strong coffee. Frank, the manager, spotted her instantly and rushed over, looking elated and slightly terrified. "Elara, is that really you? We heard you were doing great." "What a surprise," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the corner booth, which was as usual occupied. Sitting at the reserved corner booth alone was Damien Thorn. He looked exactly as she remembered, formidable and perfectly composed, reviewing papers over a black coffee. He glanced up as the commotion started, and his eyes met Elara's across the crowded room. The air thinned. The noise of the bistro faded. It was the first time they had seen each other since he left her in Hamilton, since the night he confessed his past failure to her. Damien didn't move. He simply watched her approach, a flicker of something unreadable, relief perhaps or surprise, in his dark eyes. Elara walked straight toward his table. Frank nervously tried to intercept her, but she gave him a small, firm smile that told him she was fine. "Mr. Thorn," Elara said, standing beside the booth. "Elara," he acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Please sit. You look well." She sat, feeling the familiar hum of power around him, but it no longer intimidated her. She felt equal. "I am well," she confirmed. "Thank you for that." He nodded, accepting her gratitude in silence. He didn't ask why she was there, sensing the moment was hers. "I came back here for a reason," Elara began, leaning forward slightly. "This is where we met. This is where you knelt beside me and asked me a question." Damien remembered the moment perfectly. The crashed plates, the terrified flinch, and his sharp, simple demand. "Who did this to you?" "That night," Elara continued, her voice clear and steady, "my answer was silence. I refused to answer. I refused to name him." She paused, and Damien watched her, his expression intense. "You thought my silence was the silence of fear, the silence of a victim who couldn't speak." She took a slow, deep breath, and finally, after over a year, she gave him the complete, true answer. "But my silence was the silence of a shield, Damien. It wasn't protecting me. It was protecting you." The statement hung in the air, heavier than any confession of pain. Damien's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the strategic depth of her answer. "You knew," he murmured. "Even then. I knew I had seen something he didn't want exposed, something tied to Moretti. And I knew he would hurt me terribly if I talked. If I had named him to you, a powerful man, I knew I would have drawn him out and the violence would have escalated immediately. I thought my silence would keep the danger contained to me, the only person I thought I could still protect." She looked straight at him, her eyes bright with resolution. "I chose the pain I knew over the unpredictable, greater danger of exposing his crime and escalating a conflict I didn't understand. I chose silence as a shield to keep the storm contained so I could survive." Damien Thorn sat back slowly in the booth, absorbing the full weight of her admission. She hadn't been paralyzed by fear. She had been making a calculated, desperate choice for survival. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was a profound act of self-preservation, a weapon she used to manage the threat. And in doing so, she had unknowingly prolonged his past failure. "You were wrong," Damien said, not critically but gently. "Your silence didn't contain the storm. It just delayed the reckoning." "I know that now," Elara conceded. "But by returning here today, I am proving that silence can also be a weapon. I am no longer silent. And my voice, armed with the truth, helped you dismantle the threats against both of us." She stood up, pulling a small, crisp $100 bill from her wallet. She placed it on the table. "This is for the coffee," she said, giving him another small smile. "And the price of freedom, as it turns out, is not a debt. It's a choice." Damien looked at the $100 bill. He picked it up and held it for a moment, then placed it back on the table. "The coffee is on the house, Ilara," he said, his voice carrying immense respect. "The choice, however, is all yours. Always." Ilara nodded, satisfied. She didn't look back. She walked out of the corner bistro, leaving behind the powerful man who had saved her, fully realizing that in giving her freedom, he had also given her back her voice. She drove back to Hamilton, the autumn sun shining on her face. Her life was defined by the future, not the past. The question had been answered. The shield was lowered. And the final, beautiful truth was that love and justice had won. All because a strong woman finally decided to speak. We have come to the end of the story. Thank you for watching to the end. Share your opinion about this story in the comments below. I like getting feedback from my audience. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our heartwarming stories.